guys, it's Geekonomics here, and as promised I'm back again with a set of answers and a set of contents for the answer to question 2 for the practice paper which I put up just before the Easter holidays. So let's now, without further ado, let's get stuck into question 2, part A. So part A was a 4-mark question, distinguish between FDI and debt and portfolio investment. So FDI on the one hand, debt and portfolio
Could
investment
Mr. Ingham
on
or Mr. Baines
the other.
please contact reception? Thank you.
So foreign direct investment refers to investment by foreign-based companies in factories, plant, equipment, offices, distribution centres in other countries. Debt and portfolio investment is financial investment in shares, bonds and other financial securities in a foreign country. So I think if you did that, that's sufficient for 2, but really to distinguish one from the other, I think you really need to say something about the fact that FDI will of course contribute, it makes a contribution to AD, but particularly to the productive potential, the productive capacity of an economy, the position of the long-run aggregate supply curve, the position of the PPC curve, whereas DPI, debt and portfolio investment, that is really simply investment into financial securities, and of course there's no real improvement and increase in the productive potential of an economy in that instance. So FDI is contributing, whereas the DPI is not necessarily. B. With reference to extract 4, analyse why remittances are increasingly vital to a country's economic performance. You will recall that extract 4 is the extract all about remittances, so we've got the figure 4.1, which has all of the information about FDI, remittances, overseas development assistance and so on. And then we've got our figure 4.2, which is on the next page, where you have got the where you've got the values of the remittances either as a percentage of GDP or in absolute terms. I think it's really important, ladies and gentlemen, to have an almost photographic picture of these extracts in your minds. You really ought to be at the stage now where we're getting so close to the exams that you can simply recall these in your mind and you know instantaneously what's on each extract. Anyway, I digress. Analyse. This is an analyse question, so no need for a discussion on this one. All we need is an explanation of the theory really as to why they might be increasingly important. So I think you should start off by defining remittances once again. You should define economic development, and you should once again make reference to the data. More so in recent exam sessions, the examiners are looking out for explicit reference to the data. So you may wish to comment that in 1999 the value of remittances stood at approximately 90 billion US dollars. By 2013 it was 410 billion US dollars. So over that time period we had a 355% increase in the level of remittances. Clearly a significant chunk of money. And obviously, if you wanted to compare it relative to the other financial flows in that chart, you would obviously find that remittances is the second most important, first being, of course, FDI. So, things to comment on would be, number 1, remittances are very stable. You can see it's a very stable growth path throughout that figure 4.1 for remittances. Oftentimes, indeed, the majority of the time, these monies are flowing back into these economies, these less developed economies, as gifts. They are not loans, there is no interest to be repaid, and obviously in that respect, that is a good thing, that is beneficial, that there are no loan repayments to be made on this. What else do? They help to relieve poverty. So make sure that you're familiar with the terms absolute poverty and relative poverty. Obviously, absolute poverty, people living on less than $1.25 a day. And that, of course, all of that helps to not only build up the economy, but also it can help to improve the quality of healthcare and education, and sort of the components of HDI, all of which are mentioned, of course, on extract 3. You can mention that it's a great source, remittances are a great source of disposable income for people living in these economies. Now, on the one hand, of course, that may encourage them never to seek work and never to find any employment, but we're not asked, this is not a comment question, so we wouldn't need to go into that. It helps to ease the foreign exchange constraint. Remember, one of the constraining factors and this constraining elements to growth in developing nations is that they don't have the foreign exchange reserves, the reserves of foreign currency, with which to go to the European markets with euro to bring imports in, with which to go to the American market with US dollars to bring the imports in. And so if you have family and friends sending money back, then you're able to do that. It's a great source of investment potentially into the economy, so perhaps people might use these remittances to fund some type of small business startup, and again that could potentially lead to, AD is C plus I plus G plus X minus M. Well, in terms of the investment component, therefore, and also potentially in terms of the consumption element of AD, we could see that rising. And don't forget that the investment is really, there's always a bit of a double whammy with investment in that it's an AD injection, but it's also a bit of a hit to AS as well, a bit of a boost to the capacity of the economy if you're building a new factory or starting a new small business. Don't forget, ladies and gentlemen, analyse, try and include a diagram. It's always good to include a diagram. I mention this all the time, but it's always good to include a diagram where possible. And then I think finally, let's not forget that figure 4.2 on the next page of our extract material. Worth making reference to it. And I've said here it's particularly important for the very small economies. And whilst the values are small in absolute terms, so if you think of the chart with Tajikistan, the one on the right, compared to the chart on the left, which has India and China and the larger economies on it, the countries on the right-hand chart, whilst they're all very small, and the relative values of remittances are smaller, they do account for a much greater proportion of the GDP of those economies, so they're clearly very, very important. Whereas, of course, for the likes of India, which is a much larger economy, much larger population, much larger diaspora of population, sending money back into the Indian economy, the sums are much greater. However, they contribute, and they account for a very small proportion, actually, of the GDP in the likes of India and China. So a point worth making, I feel. So I think that would be sufficient, really, and that would pretty much cover all bases on an analysed question such as that for 6 marks. Let's move this on if we can. So this is my second day on this board, ladies and gentlemen. You can see it's still not working. Okay, so question 2C. Comment on the importance of FDI, foreign direct investment, to Zambia's economic growth. So how do we go about this one? Well, first of all, first thing to note is obviously it's a comment question. Remember that requires a two-handed discussion, two-sided discussion on the one hand, on the other hand, and then a conclusion at the end based on evidence, not opinion. Positive economics rather than normative. Yes. So what would we include here? So I think it would be important, number one, again, to define foreign direct investment. Define economic growth. You may wish to say that you can have short-run economic growth and long-run economic growth. Point number 3, FDI, foreign direct investment. As we've just mentioned on the B answer there, it's going to lead to a boost in AD and AS, and also potentially a shift of the PPC, or production possibility curve, or frontier, outwards. And again, ladies and gentlemen, the more in my view, the more diagrams the better. So I'll throw another diagram in there. Point worth making with regard to X efficiency and X inefficiency. I hope you've heard of this term before, to do with the efficiency of the public sector environment relative to the private sector. You know that public sector institutions are inherently inefficient, bureaucratically inefficient. So many people there who are not accountable, and their jobs are not monitored closely, and so the efficiency is very, very slack, or sometimes referred to as organisational slack. Well, if you get foreign direct investment, primarily through private sector and private investment, then these companies, they will want to be highly efficient because they want to make a return for themselves, for their shareholders, for their employees, and consequently they're more likely to be efficient. So, point worth making. And then point 5, I think it's worth mentioning that when we get to extract 5, the key focus of Zambia's economic policy is on enterprise zones. The private sector reform program, and so on and so forth. I think that should say private sector, ladies and gentlemen. It says public. I'm pretty sure that should say private sector reform program, development reform program. And of course, this is something which is improving the private sector, and again there's a whole issues therefore with regard to efficiency, efficiency. You could also throw in discussion here if you wished about potentially allocative and productive efficiency. I don't think you need to go into it in any big style, but it's certainly something that you could throw in here, because at this stage we are now competent and confident at dealing with the micro and the macro and just bundling it all together seamlessly and coherently. However, this is of course a comment question, so these are all the pros really and why it is important. Now let's consider why FDI might not be the be-all and end-all for Zambia's economic development. Number 1, these multinational companies, these transnational companies, corporations who are investing into these developing economies, they tend to be highly capital intensive, and therefore the amount of job opportunities for people in these economies is relatively low. Point 2, these companies employ their own specialist workers a lot of the time, especially in Zambia. I'm not sure if you've had a chance to have a look at the interview I carried out with my colleague who worked in Zambia for 4 or 5 years, but one of the things he mentions on that was that the Chinese, whilst they invested a lot into Zambia and South Africa in particular, whilst the South African economy invested quite significantly, they tended to bring in their own specialist workers, and so the population of Zambia, they were simply displaced by workers from outside. Now that of course does not help the Zambian unemployment problem. Thirdly, FDI, we've got the construction of the manufacturing plant within Zambia, but of course that leads to a flow of funds out of the economy, rent, interest, profits, dividends. They're not staying in the economy, they're all flowing out of the economy. It's like all of the money that goes into football nowadays, it all flows out. Fourthly, we are told that there's little tax revenue collected, and indeed as a consequence the Zambian government is considering resource nationalisation. Now of course, as you know, nationalisation is the opposite of privatisation. So we would be moving from a position of having private enterprise to public enterprise, state-owned again. Now that is totally against particularly this whole notion of efficiency, because that's likely to become much more inefficient, and it will also deter, put off further investment by foreign companies. So it's a disincentive to FDI. My upper six this year, we've been reading the book by Joseph Stiglitz, which is called, Making Globalization Work, I believe. But anyway, in his book, Stiglitz refers to MNCs, multinational companies, as being very footloose. So they have no loyalty to an economy, they have no loyalty to the local employees and the local community, and when they invest, they're investing for selfish reasons, primarily probably because it's cheap or there's an abundance of a particular resource. But when they exploit everything that they want, when they strip it bare, they will very quickly shut up shop and leave. And so it's very unstable in terms of the contribution to the local economy, in terms of the contribution to jobs, the local multiplier, and so on and so forth. It's all very temporary. Number 6. The government, whilst they may not agree with a lot of the practices that these companies do, they are very frightened to tackle them about it because they are frightened of scaring them away. They don't want them to shut up shop and leave. And so the governments are pretty powerless to take any action with them. And then finally, the multinational companies, the multinational corporations, they're fairly unlikely to be investing into health and education and so on, which of course economic growth is obviously to do with real output and so on, but in terms of the human development aspect of it, this is something that the multinational companies are unlikely to do unless there's some sort of contract and coercion for them to do so. So I think mention all of these points, mention the on the other hand, so that's on the one hand, on the other hand. Don't forget, ladies and gentlemen, the examiners, they get 400 or 500 scripts each. So make life easy for the examiner, signpost your answers by starting your paragraph with, on the one hand, da 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 da. On the other hand, on balance, evidence suggests that, and then your conclusion. That makes it so easy for the examiner to mark, and a happy examiner, believe you me, ladies and gentlemen, although this shouldn't be the case, but it's probably the case that the happy examiner, the examiner who receives that script, which is lovely and well set out, and diagrams are nice and neat, and the handwriting is so clear and legible, you're more likely to get, I would think, towards the upper end of the mark band thresholds than if an examiner has to read it and reread it and really concentrate on it and go from one page to the next for diagrams and so on and so forth. Make life easy for the examiner, I would suggest. So that's it, ladies and gentlemen, question 2C, and I shall be back in a moment with question 3, the essay.